We are live. What are we, Alex?
Da, 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 da. We are live.
You know what else we are? Is men with a YouTube channel with 100 subscribers. I don't hear many people in these here parts with 3 digits, in their subscriber count. So
Slow clap.
Parky for ourselves. Welcome back, everyone. It's our pleasure and serious privilege to welcome you to Luca Teller's YouTube channel, where we're systematically just going through, seemingly systematically going through Aristotle's Metaphysics. We are now on discussion 8, and we've acknowledged before off camera that this is a bit of an interregnum period where we're taking a break from the ordinary discourse and flow of discussion to take a little bit of a side quest, but acknowledge that that's what we're doing, with the codicil that the discussions we were having from episodes 1 to 6, which if you haven't seen them yet, definitely go back and watch. Some of them will be on screen right now. But yeah, some of those discussions definitely had some loose ends and needed consolidating. There were some underexplored ideas that needed to be given a bit more of a framing or a bit more of a limelight. And we also just wanted to have more of a free-flowing discussion that wasn't so reliant on, repeatedly going back to the text at hand, even though we're loosely, traipsing through this magnum opus of a work. We do want to just have fun as bros by the campfire, and a lot of that comes from free association and free flowing back and forth, which is why it's two men such as ourselves of our stature doing this, and not just any old men, and any old men. Like, we're young men, we're 25, so we have to honor that. We have to live not anachronistically. We have to enact for our age, for our time, honor the zeitgeist, and bring Aristotle in a palatable way to the masses, which is the kind of, I guess, the meta goal here. A part of the discussions we're having in this bit of a 2-part critique of metaphysics itself is an attempt to frame ourselves and understand our today and through the lens of the past, so that we can situate ourselves in ancient Greece. Understand ancient Greece so we can understand ourselves today, using history as a bit of a roadmap, or even like a portal into ourselves, if you will. One thing I was thinking about earlier this week before I hand it over to you, Alex, for a bit of a recap as per our loose structure, I just wanted to acknowledge and pat ourselves on our backs for once and acknowledge our noble neutrality. I feel like me and you have a particular set of skills, much like Liam Neeson in Taken, where we can remain emotionally detached from ideas. We can play with them and then put them down and embark onwards and upwards. It's almost like an ataraxia of meaningfully allowing ideas to come and pass through this, in this panoply or in this theater of our consciousness. And so that, as a precondition in terms of character, requires a richness and vitality, right? To study and venerate something that is here right now in front of you, in spirit of dialogos, in spirit of dharma, hierarchy, right? Hierarchy, hieros, archos, honoring the holy order. And to do that, it requires a richness in spirit and a playfulness and a happiness when you come to the battleground for this. So I just wanted to pat ourselves on the back for doing that. And then, so basically what we're doing here is refocusing on the critiques of metaphysics. When we were in episode 6, Aristotle was talking a lot about the questions that presuppose the study of the pinnacle of philosophy, which is interrogating or investigating the underlying nature of reality. And let's stop here for a second and ask the necessary questions before we launch into something so vast in its enterprise. And I think me and you have kind of taken that and run with it and are asking all sorts of questions and critiquing it from all sorts of angles now before we get into metaphysics proper in the remainder of the book, in episodes what will be 9 and onwards in our series. So we're basically doing introspections. We're foregrounding introspection at the cost of inspection momentarily. You put it really beautifully in our last discussion when you said, I think you mentioned Jung, but maybe you might have just been saying it yourself, something about imbuing matter in front of us with spirit. And that's kind of the spirit itself of these these two discussions, especially, I felt that a lot in the last episode, and I'm sure I'll feel it today. I'll hand it over to you for the recap, and then I wanted to read out a quote to set the tone for the actual beginning of the discussion. So over to you, sir. And welcome.
Hey, we're back. Yeah, I was honestly by the end of it, Luca, I was feeling the Holy Spirit. I was feeling it working inside, man. So that was a beautiful sermon to start us off with as we here honor our physiology, honor our youthfulness, and the young spirits that we are, and also the older souls that we are. I think it's worthwhile to have a bit of that introspection and again taking account of where we are in this moment of our lives, in this moment of our quest of Aristotle, and in this moment of sacred presence between you and I. There's a lot to this podcast and to a style of philosophy that is to take account of things. I think that is what the Logos was almost understood in ancient Greece by thinkers like Heraclitus and Plato and Aristotle. To give an account of something and to take account of something. So I really appreciate how we are bringing that youthful, lighthearted attitude, like cuss word slurp, it doesn't phase. It's just part of doing something seriously, is seeing much deeper than the cuss words and what that triggers, and seeing into the substance behind what we're saying. I feel as well that we're doing this in a relatively timeless way. It's going to be something that's worthwhile listening to 10 years from now, 20 years, 50 years. And it's got that ability, because if you looked at this 10 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago, it would still hold that value. It's on that edge of locating self within world and finding what are those constituent parts of the world that we come from and that we inhabit, that we are deeply embodied, that we're firmly placed in. What does that look like? How can we understand it better? What are some of the relations that matter in a world like this? And so because those questions are what, like the way that the meaning of these podcasts goes much deeper than, the periphery, like terms and jokes and like comments we make that might be distasteful to some. There's a real substance like through its core. And I think what we're doing with this podcast and with our discourse is penetrating through this other field of language and technology and, attitudinal critique that we have and skepticism that we have for things, penetrating through that into a place of, the authentic and also, the real attempt and to the passion for life. And so 100 years ago, that was a relevant thing. 100 years in the future, it's going to be a relevant thing. So I'm really pleased, and that's why it is a pleasure to be putting something out there which has meaning for time to come. And it doesn't mean that what we say stands here and holds as something that is unchanging, but it just means the approach and the way that we're doing this equally to what we are doing, like what is the content of what we're saying, that's going to be just as important. That's why your grandkids have got to get on this. Yeah, also what you're saying in that emotional detachment, like at the same way, in the same turn of us speaking so passionately, we're doing so and not getting caught up by the passions. Like it's very much, you have that integrated and controlled and complete sort of grasp of psychic content and of, what's salient, what's relevant. And I think it's a skill to have a bit of detachment, emotional detachment to what you're talking about, when the purposes of what you're talking about is to get closer to like the ideas, right? In the same way that science instrumentalizes perception, or in the same way that science objectifies the world, it does so that it can kind of come at it at different days and among different people and different cultures and find the same truth. Here too, we could come to these same ideas on different days with different people across different cultures and hopefully arrive at the same truth. And it's because we don't have this emotional flux which makes up our psyche unhelpfully influencing what we're saying. But the paradox is, it doesn't mean we're emotionless in what we're saying. Like, I'm packed full of emotion. That's completely what I'm doing here. I'm completely being emotional. That's why, like, heart on my sleeve, like this is what is me. Like, to understand me is to see me right here. And so it's beautiful and paradoxical to be in that moment. And it for me also comes back to one of the first things we were saying here and musing on, was the philosophical dictum of to know thyself, and how that was a sign above the Platonic school of philosophy. To enter into the gates of that school, one needs to know thyself, or to know like that's what you're doing here. When you go into philosophy, you're learning that you're coming more attuned to who you are, as I said, understanding the self in the world. So happy to be here. And shall I get into the intro of the last episode?
You shall.
I think I can do it pretty succinctly, because you did touch on some of the key parts and framing of it. So I already feel like we're sort of in here and in motion. Yeah. For me, we really looked at the dialectics of modernity in the last episode. We were once again taking account our technological situation and our techno-feudal situation, and how that is impacting our own ability to connect to the real in ways that we can't even see. So there's a real entanglement of self and technology there. And in the same way that we as subjects have an unconscious, we act out on impulse, and we have an inner life of fantasies that are constantly arising. And even just to perceive and to breathe and to think, there's a whole host of physiological unconscious processes giving us that capacity. In the same way that it's hard to know ourselves, when we infuse technology with ourselves and we get to a point where we're so simultaneous with technology that it's an extension of who we are now, is our phones, our ability to call and connect and talk, our ability to host this series and broadcast it to people and form community. It's so much of who we are as interconnected people, that in the same way that before technology we had an unconscious, after technology that still has an unconscious, and it still is interacting with us in unconscious ways. And that makes the problem just a lot more difficult in getting a grasp on what's happened and understanding the full extent and impact that technology broadly has on us, and like digital technology now in social medias and large language models that are like our sidekicks. So there's a lot to pass there, to spread out and observe. And it is part of the philosophy of metaphysics and of ethics and of aesthetics in the future, has got to be integrated with and understand technology well. And so that was the core of our last discussion. And yeah, I think just if we are uncritical about how we're using technology, then it's our offspring who suffer. It's our kids that are being raised on it without proper guidance. It's the habits they form without proper caregiving. It also, as we talked about, offers an incredibly rich source of potential for self-learning and for education and for community and for connection. Like all those values that are parroted by social media companies do exist, but it's not a given that that's what we get. Like we go to social media technologies and we're told that, we're given the access to connect with everyone in every way about everything. And yet because we do so in an uncritical way, because there's a lot of dynamics with the attention that these social media companies are originally designed their algorithms for, there's a lot of ways in which that whole kind of Peter Pan-esque dream just comes crashing down and hits us in the form of neurosis and of alienation and detachment. And so there's a danger that they pose just for the health and vitality of a self and of a society. But there's also a large potential there. We explored how there's potentially newer difficulties in living and growing up as an adolescent to a teenager to a young adult in today's society than it used to be before, because of how pernicious these technologies are to hack into our physiological architecture, how there's such an easy dopamine trigger that we can access, how we can feel like we're making progress in our lives, but we're really just in a virtual world in a video game, and how without the right level of understanding what's happening, it's really tough. And without the right guidance and wisdom around how to use all that information in a helpful way, rather than letting it kind of just attack and fret and get in places where it's not meant to be as we become symbiotic with technology. Without that critical lens, then we're screwed. And it leads to a malaise. It leads to a discomfort and an illness, and maybe we don't know something in the back of our heads, and we just don't know what it is. And it's this wearing away of our vitality and of our passion and of our motivation and of our goal directedness, because we can get all of that on a screen. It's a cycle that closes in on itself, because the more we are on our phones, the more we feel disconnected. So the more we go on our phones for that, and we just kind of go around in that loop. There's a lot of technology that works really well for us. We have good infrastructure, we have good housing, we can fly anywhere in the world, we can go to these amazing concerts with just super impressive music that's never been able to be created before. And a lot of those things don't give us problems to the same way. They're often very functional and helpful. But I guess the more we put our psyche into something, the more we try and create our psyche, like a global brain or like a personal assistant, that's when it has some tough backbite for some reason. Yeah, one of the quotes that came up from the last conversation, which was particularly striking, was, to take account of our technological society is one, and more so of that Gen Z and Gen Alpha age. It's an age where we're simulating our dopamine and confusing ourselves by our lack of achievement. Not seeing that they're totally connected, that it's totally A and B. And so we talked about our response to technology after having taken account where to from here. And there was some discussion around the different approaches there are. I think what we found in the conversation that is just a very first person, it's a very existential calling that comes from something so existential as technology. So it's like, where do you go first within yourself and within showing care for others? And it doesn't look like telling someone what they should do, in my opinion. Like, it looks like setting up times where you can go hang out at the park, or where you can like join a new sports team, or you can start a club that goes to the park and is doing journaling, or you can host a potluck. These things that can connect us back to each other without the means of technology directly interfering in an unhelpful way. Those are the places that we can start to respond to this. And again, through that, refine our values, refine if like our stance on ethical matters and our appreciation for aesthetic matters and our devotion to religious matters. That's where we can do it. It's in the person to person contact.
Yeah, that's a beautiful encapsulation of the spirit that was rampant in the previous conversation, and a nice succinct summary of well, as succinct as you'll get from Alex, from kind of the spirit of the podcast so far. I did have some notes I wanted to add to that, and some energies I felt I also want to bring to the fore before we go into the discussion proper. Should I do that now?
Yeah, do it while we've got it all simmering. Go
Okay.
for it.
Yeah, so you kind of acknowledged, I guess what I was hearing was the puzzlement of kind of hyper reality setting in, you know? We kind of feel this morose pathos growing in us as the individual of confusion, right? There's disconcertment all around, but all around it's confusion. It's almost like if there was a clear roadmap, we could get it done, but everything feels one step this way, two steps that way, three steps forward and back. And of course, part of that is the nature of life itself with a capital L, you know? It's simply a matter of trial and error, trials and tribulation, but then there's also the element of added simulated confusion that once might not have been there. And a stream I want to really stretch out in this conversation to come is the antichrist nature of the impositional impediment of technology in our lives, you know? That's a spirit you were really paying homage to and giving credit to in the last conversation. And I was coming at it very much from a deliberate Nietzschean angle, and one I hold close to my chest, but I'd like to give the devil his due. And in this case, that would actually be Nietzsche. Like, Nietzsche is the devil in some sense, and he's proudly so, you know?
In what sense? Like, he's the devil in relation to this frame? In what way?
In relation to achieving sagacity, the best way to know Christ is to really know Antichrist. And the best steel manning we have of that in the last 200 years might be the Nietzschean worldview. So in terms of achieving...
he's like achieving sagacity in some ways, like having that deep discernment. And for Nietzsche, that looks like really understanding the Antichrist, and maybe even needing to go into more of that anti-Christian ethos, which is really just, it's not like devilish antichrist energy kind of thing. It's more like, what's the inverse of symbolic structure? You know, what does it look like when shared meaning and community breaks down and we're left with like ourselves and the void? It's more in that space of what the Nietzschean antichrist is. And you're saying it's almost going into those territories that we have hitherto locked up, that we've hitherto put aside, that we've hitherto, like, I almost want to think of this in those psychodynamic terms of, like kind of rationalized and put aside.
Honoring pagan, beast, and the paroxysms in man.
And going there to refine some of the antidote to what is now.
Yes. Yeah. And particularly salient at a time where you feel like, I almost feel, you might disagree with this, but we're living in a time of Christianity on steroids. I feel like there's a moral order that limits us and impedes upon our free volition in ways that we couldn't have even imagined. And so I feel like one possible avenue to explore as it pertains to the antidote to this is the pagan way to go about things. It's not, you know, exhaustive in any stretch of the imagination, but that's something we can definitely talk about and tease out more. The other thoughts that were coming to mind is just the kind of all round, doom and gloom nature of man merging with machine. We obviously gave a lot of ode to the positives and negatives of that. We can see concerts in amazing quality. We're experiencing 4 dimensions, seemingly like in more iridescent, more impressive, and in more imprintful ways on our senses than ever before, and that's so enjoyable. But then after the great concert, you still go home to your shitty life, So I don't know. There's that element to it. With the hyper reality stuff and the confusion and puzzlement that comes from that, we have implosion rather than explosion, right? The spirit of our times seems to be like things imploding in on one another, things that once aren't simply just over there, we're over here, and it's falling and withering and being destructed in front of our eyes, like the climax scene in Fight Club, where you see the big banks, big finance being really catastrophized and blown up to smithereens in front of Mala and the narrator. It's rather an implosion rather than an explosion, where wholes are being absorbed into one another rather than running off into their own thing, doing their own unrestricted, uninhibited thing. So yeah, there's one way to capture this in words is just by saying it doesn't feel like someone's beating me with a hammer. It feels like the walls are closing in, and there's the analogy of the frog boiling to death slowly, right, and not realizing it. There's clear miscategorization, misapprehension in ways that are solvable, and then the more concerning ones which are unsolvable. The solvable ones might be things like we have a media that doesn't mediate. Why do we call it media? You would think media means, or is a part and parcel, or is a root word of mediation between one real state and another. But when one real state becomes a representation, maybe the point of media simply evaporates into nothingness. So why do we still have a media? Questions, very central grounding questions like that phase us, whether we realize it or not. It's affecting and impacting and implicating on our day-to-day actions a lot. We also mentioned the medium is the message. You brought up McLuhan's famous quip. And yeah, I guess in the theme of implosion and inner absorption, I would say that implicates the end of the medium and the message, right? There's no winner here. So it's not like we're here, the elites are there, in a very socio-political sense. It's not like we're here and it's you versus me and it's game theory and someone else is winning. And when you're caught in a true game theory across time, when you iterate, no one wins, because the arms race goes to the bottom, not to the top. So I just wanted to, pay credit to that as well. And then read out to kind of summarize all of this energy in a more articulate and I'd say more erudite manner. This is from the preface from Difference and Repetition. It's a rather lengthy quote, so strap in, and then we can launch into the discussion proper, unless you have some quips about this as well. All these signs may be attributed to a generalized anti-Hegelianism. Difference and repetition have taken the place of the identical and the negative, of identity and contradiction. For difference implies the negative and allows itself to lead to contradiction, only to the extent that its subordination to the identical is maintained. The primacy of identity, however conceived, defines the world of representation. But modern thought is born of the failure of representation, of the loss of identities, and of the discovery of all the forces that act under the representation of the identical. The modern world is one of simulacra. Man did not survive God, nor did the identity of the subject survive that of substance. All identities are only simulated, produced as an optical effect by the more profound game of difference and repetition. So I see like an unearthing and a regurgitating of a dormant flux, a waking up of the old gods, which is why I invoke terminology like pagan spirit, to act as a seeming antidote to the Christian malaise.
That quote in itself is quite difficult to understand. There was a few parts that like stuck out and are great, but it almost feels like that's kind of the tantra around which we're like circling and giving real effect to. But like at the core of it, when you get to the dialectic, it's like put in some weird language that's like really hard to discern and takes like a lot of time to understand it, like understand the language first of all, and then understand the meaning of it. Um, yeah, and also in what you said, yeah, like a simulated confusion is part of like our moment. I think that so seems to be a lot of ways in which that is what we're doing, like simulating our own confusion, and that's why it's deeply resolved yet disconnected. We find ourselves in a fragmented trifecta. What we need is not grand perfection, nor the sole reliance on recollection, for it is all to be found in deep connection. The first part of deeply resolved and yet disconnected, that simulated confusion, like it's we're so free to like unplug and to step back and go, hey, look at where I am, look at who I am, look at what I'm going to do. But we don't unplug.
But that's the exact centrality of this quote, right? We say, look at who I am, as opposed to look who I am not or could not be or what you are, because we subordinate to identity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm even thinking about how there's like a freedom that we have, but that we just can't realize. Like we're determined to be
Yes.
unfree.
And
And yet we could only be determined to be unfree if there was something true about being free.
or desirable, right? The burden of freedom idea is well fleshed out in literature through Dostoevsky, notably. I don't know many people who could handle absolute freedom.
Even what about a little bit of freedom? Like a little bit of real freedom is also a currency that's a little bit hard to come by in today's simulated, confused age. But I mean, it's yeah, I feel like a lot of people would just say, hey, like I'm happy with the liberties and the account that I have, and like, yeah, it's an interesting mix out there. A lot of like siloed people and cultures and communities, and yeah, you're just it's kind of building on each other. There was another interesting part in what you'd mentioned of like today being the most like Christianity on steroids that we've had. Um, a few takes on it. It's not like I disagree, but I would just like seek to qualify what's been said there.
Yeah.
I almost see how, particularly in like Western culture, but also in how like the scientific enterprise has spread out very large and wide, and how within the scientific enterprise there is very like religious like structures on that. So even just the form that it takes and having a method and having a hierarchical order and having its own systemic functioning universality and access to the truth. It has like a religious like subscription to it because it gives us access to the real, just in the same way that Christianity has a religious like subscription because it gives us access to the real. But also at the very heart of the scientific enterprise is this search for truth, and like nothing but that. That is the value that science lives out. And the metaphysic it lives out is that truth is accessible and that truth is real and we can find it and we can get close correspondence to what is real and actual out there through our study and observation and empirical refinement and rational speculation. But where did the value of truth come from? Values are value laden. They come from a human positive impulse. They come from something we see as meaningful and orients us in our lives. And we make decisions based on that and we uphold it, even though it's not always immediately justifiable. It's not immediately rational to say, I value this because X. A lot of the times we almost falter at that, and that's where the role of faith comes in for some. It's to say, no, this has worked for us in the past, although in this immediate present, I can't give you a justification of to why I'm pursuing truth in this way. But I know that being devoted to this pursuit, I can get to where I need to. Even that itself is almost a Christian idea at the core of Christ embodying truth, and through the Christian, I guess, sentiment of wanting to come to know what is, and wanting to know revelation, and wanting to get close to the source of God, that has instilled in our psyche this pursuit to find something salvatory and redemptive for us, and that is what truth is. Truth is redemption. And we've now taken it, and we have learned that as an impulse, because truth isn't selected for in an evolutionary way, in some sense. Like Donald Hoffman would say that, and a lot of people would disagree with him, but precise, like the act of mathematics was definitely not selected for, because we never did mathematics for thousands and thousands of years. There were different selection pressures there, and yet we come here now with mathematical capability, which can give us access to real patterns and real realities. But it's not like that was a value that we had to learn throughout evolution. It was one that we've adopted and taken forward. And that's why things like the philosophical turn in Greece, or the Christian birth in Jerusalem, it's why that was so substantial in culture and in human culture, because we learned things such as using language in aim for truth, or in aim to understand something better, or to learn how to live in an ethical way. And what is an ethical way? It's sort of crystallizing all the different traditions before it into an answer that it can authentically take forward, and posit, as part of the Christian communities that started, and how that precipitated into the Western culture. It is really a birthing of truth that we've learned and adopted, and now apply into the material world. So I think in that way, Christianity on steroids is just like you've got Abel and Cain, and yeah, they kind of are at war with each other constantly, but they're from the same family. And you couldn't have atheism if you didn't have Christianity, is something that Slavoj Žižek would point to. That it's only through the, I guess, taking the weapons of Christianity, taking the weapons of truth, and attacking that very foundation with our rational, empiricist, scientific worldview of there are no values, there are just things that we observe in the world, and humans put values on them. It's like, yeah, a battle. And that's why it's Christianity on steroids. You have a battle of like one Christian and another Christian who's in a simulated confusion and battling it out. Okay, riff over. I'm done there.
When I say Christianity on steroids, I think I mean it as a double-edged sword of being a serious compliment of it's so ubiquitous and so pervasive in our modern day culture, and it's also to be refuted because it's what's holding us back. So yeah, I mean it in both ways. I think there's a major conflation of the word truth, and there has been across time, and we take it, we make with it, we do with it what we want as per our convenience and as per our experience based on the position we're in, which is perennially provisional. Like there's nothing that can be staked as a claim in the ground for here, for now, forever, And even earlier when you were talking about how this podcast will act as at least a time capsule, I agree. And it's not because what we're saying is eternal or perennial, it's because what we're saying is inexhaustible, and therein lies the sacredness. It's not because this here right now, the here now will be true 8,000 years from now, but it will be useful, and it will be implementable, and it will be polyvalent as it is now in the future. That's why even Hinduism is called Sanatan Dharma, right? The eternal righteousness, not the eternal truth, because that's impossible. And so, yeah, so part of it is just the subjectivity, the relativity of how you define truth. I want to pay credit to the idea of the spirit of gravity and decay and corruption setting in as the instincts degenerate in Nietzsche on steroids fashion, and say that something becomes true by much collective trial and tribulation, long experience, as he calls it. It proves itself time and time over. And then it becomes mandatory, right? We hang the tablet of our will to power over our people. It is now compulsory. It is now mandatory. As a result, tangential values and conditions enter into the field of our awareness and consciousness, but that code becomes further sanctified and kind of unassailable and venerable, and no one touch it. It becomes the word of God. It becomes the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were well fought over, well earned, and there's a level of wisdom in them that no one human being could possibly muster or come up with themselves. And that's part of the idea of the deserved veneration of collective wisdom. But then the origin of that code eventually becomes forgotten just through the passage of time and evolution. Eventually that starts to become decayed and starts to wither and still lord over us, which is the complaint that the modern day liberal has over the modern day conservative. Obviously, these are very like catch-all terms. Nothing about a modern day liberal is liberal, and no conservative I've met is trying to conserve anything. There's also a differentiation to be made between the biosphere and the sociosphere and the level of emphasis we place on what and when. But eventually something that was considered a priori and irrefutable comes under question, and then you see this toppling over of statues. And so I don't wonder, but I also wonder playfully, what we're calling truth, when we're calling truth, and then what is it in service to? So someone like Foucault would say it is what we call truth is actually just the will to exactitude, which is an inversion or a contorting of the will to knowledge, which is an instrument of the will to power. Our object was never to know in the first place. We overestimate our own sanctity and our goodness by saying, I just want knowledge. I just want to know more because it's pure and it's vital and it's going to grow us, me and us all together. We'll all the tide that rises all boats. But when we say that, our true objective, right, hermeneutics of suspicion, our objective was never to know. It was simply, and this isn't even evil, but it was simply to impose as much form and regularity upon like the infinite chaos just outside the light that the fire in the middle of the forest touches, as our practical needs require. So all of this can sound very dry because it becomes like a transactional, like what you need is what becomes true for now, and then we let go of it. But I think that's what we're doing. And I think now is a time more than ever when we need to revitalize the spirit of maximal fluidity in our objects of encounter. So that would be my piece on that.
What I would be keen to do now is to unearth some of the, I think we've done like a great, summation and riffing and like clarifying of where we've been in our last few episodes, and now feeling like we can continue this walk.
Yeah, nice.
Cool. And the first stop here, there's two, and who knows how many side tunnels we're gonna end up excavating. But the kind of two things we want to bring to this discussion is a critical lens of metaphysics itself, understanding, who are the antagonizers against metaphysics, who has been there to critique this as a practice itself, because it is quite heady, it can be quite abstract, it for some comes across as quite nonsensical. And I think for us, before we go into like Aristotle's metaphysics proper, before we get into book Gamma, where he's now starting to talk about what metaphysics studies and then going into what substances and his categories, before doing that, we're kind of at like a half time. We're already taking half time and we're about 1/8 of the way through the book. But there is a bit of a junction point here, and we were feeling it ourselves, knowing criticisms of metaphysics from science, who's saying, it's a lot of mumbo jumbo that philosophers are doing, but are quite misguided, because look here, You have to be in the real world, practicing real science to get any truth value of what you're talking about, because otherwise you can't verify it. It's non-provable. You're inventing concepts and just dealing with that, and it's not worth our time. And so to have an address to that, or to at least explore what that perspective is, it's one that has been lingering and lasting for a good while. And so to at least incorporate it into what we're doing here, so that we're not doing metaphysics on a branch that someone's looking to saw off. We can actually go back to the root of that and question whether or not that saw has the teeth to cut the branch, or whether we can keep this branch and let it be part of the tree of life. That was nice. Now, the second part is language, is the second place we're going to go. Equally, people have criticized metaphysics as asking too many questions, and essentially asking so many questions that if we just go upstream, all we have is a question, and everything downstream is ungrounded and non-referential. It doesn't point to any true facts about the world. And so when we're talking in these categorical terms of being and time and freedom and will and nothingness, and lots of terms that come up in metaphysics, okay, if upstream there is no real grounding in reality, or through our language we are actually losing any grounding that language does offer us because we're creating concepts, then we're losing any meaning that those concepts have. And so those two are both like valid critiques, and they seem to be important, and they seem to be really important to consider. And so in this episode, it's about looking at those perspectives and seeing where there is truth to them, and seeing what that means and how we modify our practice of metaphysics and how we are in discourse about it, and whether we can still go ahead with it in an authentic way, knowing that there is some kind of truth disclosure here. We wouldn't be doing this series if we subscribed completely to either the scientific critique or linguistic critique. But as philosophers, we have the freedom to go deeply into each perspective and to find the truth of it and take it with us on the journey. That's potentially a move that the scientist couldn't manage, or the linguist couldn't manage. But us in our continentality are going to embark on this.
Absolutely, man. And this harkens back to the healthy emotional detachment idea I was talking about, of pick something up, play with it, and leave it down if it doesn't work for you, or if you're just a child in a candy store and you need to move on. This has to not defer too far away from Leela. So I think that's a nice that's nice. Like, if that all of it feels like a divine play, not Maya but Leela, then that's how that you're at least then that's how that the brick wall is actually a feather wall, and the battleground is actually a arena. So I also want to I'm going to play devil's advocate to my own devil's advocate and say that there is a lot of validity as far as essence can be disclosed through logic that I want to talk about. There is an argument to be made that logic trumps metaphysics, and that's the main family of thought when it comes to who are these people that are trying to come up with these concepts, that are saying all these unverifiable, unprovable things, and isn't the psychology and the psyche of the man making the claim what's more fundamental? We've gone back and forth on this a lot, but to stick up for that side for a second, one reason that logic trumping metaphysics actually makes sense as it pertains to the topic of truth with a capital T is because we know through Wittgenstein, for example, that failure conditions in logical structures disclose deep essence. So we have many different forms in which we can configure and reconfigure grammatical statements, but ways in which sentences don't plug in and out of those as a phraseology tell us what the inherent meaning of the picture theory it underlies is. to give a very basic, grounded example, I can say I went to the park, Alex came with me. I can say me and Alex went to the park, and both of those roughly mean the same thing. And the reason that those two roughly mean the same thing is because the words me and Alex are actually the accidentals, Wittgenstein would say in the sentence. They're the plug in, plug out feature. The invariant essential is the structure that underlies it, namely X and Y went to Z. So yes, the accidentals seem arbitrary. I could just as easily say me and me and Fred went to the park. But what follows as a result of the seemingly arbitrary accidentals isn't arbitrary. What follows therefrom actually discloses a deep truth about the structure of our conditioning, language, perspective, and reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so almost kind of Chomsky fashion,
Yes,
when you
very Chomsky.
boil language down from the phonetics, like what we hear and just what goes back and forth, to the pragmatics, how that's all done in a social situation, to the semantics, what is the meaning that's exchanged in a social situation. You go to the final layer, you get to the syntax of how things are symbolically arranged and communicated. And it's at that level where we can, almost from that abstracted principle, start to uncover essences in the structure of language, and how when we're saying things in one way, it's going to mean a certain thing. And if we substitute things, it's still going to mean a certain thing. But if we change around that structure, there's limitations to it. And so we can find out ways in which language, like we can stress test language to find out where it's real. And knowing that reality, like we at least now have a orientation and approach to like falsifying the structure of language.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I mean. Yeah.
Got it. Nice. It's like we've been studying the same people or something. Yeah, I think we'll just go to language, and we can come to science later if it needs our time, which I'm not sure it does. But right, sure. That's a great jumping off place, a good taster for what's to come. I think on the horizon for me is a bit of Wittgenstein, a bit of Gerald Katz, and the metaphysics of meaning, and how he outlines Wittgenstein's critique of theories of meaning and of the legitimacy of philosophy. And also what's coming up is, how Katz responds to that, how Heidegger responds to that, I think is very powerful. Heidegger wasn't directly responding to Wittgenstein, but his phenomenology and his phenomenological account of what language is offers a very rich picture that is much richer than the picture theory that Wittgenstein puts forward, in a way, right? Because it's not all like logical lettering.
Yes.
For Heidegger, it's a lot more like, this is a challenge to articulate, but I guess like relational giving and taking.
It's a logical rhizome.
Yeah. What's that?
Heidegger's phenomenological laying out or delineation of that idea is more arborescent in nature, right?
What's that?
It's not a ladder. Like it's what we've been talking about with the one step here, not one step forward, one step back, but one step here, one step there, completely in a way that you couldn't have even envisioned when you set out. It's Poe at the foot of Jade Palace once again, who doesn't know that there's 1,000 steps until he takes the first step, and then he realizes there's 10,000, but not steps, buckets. Like that's the level of variability that Heidegger brings in.
Yeah, great.
That was so sarcastic.
I don't deploy sarcasm in that way. So essentially, this is where we're running the gauntlet of Wittgenstein. And if you look at philosophy today, you have the analytic and continental traditions. And a lot of the analytic tradition has, been taking this linguistic turn in philosophy, it's made such a large branching of philosophy to be analyzing the words we're using and the phrases that they're constructed in and the propositions that those are constructed in and the facts of world that those propositions are denoting. And it's, all of kind of logic gets taken up and linguistics gets taken up. And, rational empiricism and skepticism is taken up in that. And it's a very massive part of philosophy today, almost where some people would say that it's more important than continental philosophy because of the accuracy it can give us, because of how it has and is able to maintain a sort of scientific rigor. And who was at like the heart of that big turn was Wittgenstein himself, for what he contributed very ardently and forthrightly. And yeah, he almost came out as a very, he almost aspired to be a very big and impactful philosopher. And the times he tried to do that, he failed. But what was left after his attempts was actually quite a big shift and change. And so we're dealing with a very seminal figure, one of those axis figures in philosophy. And yeah, you were getting into kind of his picture theory of meaning. I think what's helpful here is to understand the stakes that are on the table. And it, like, for Wittgenstein, and maybe even we can do a little bit of a bio on who he was and that kind of thing, and then just to help picture an understanding of this guy and make it concrete. But what's at stake is the practice of philosophy and metaphysics. He was someone who really thought you couldn't do metaphysics, that you had to remain silent of it. He knew it was important. He felt like religion and ethics and metaphysics was an important thing, but it was also something that we couldn't speak about. So he held this kind of paradoxical relationship to, the essences of what's important in life.
Scholars of Wittgenstein treat the Tractatus as a mystical book.
Yeah. Yes. And it's exactly because the second half was the most important, and the second half was the half that he didn't write. So you have this prelude to something which is taking us right to the precipice of, okay, what's now most important to talk about and discover and learn. And that's the unwritten half. So that totally checks. The most important half of this podcast is the silence that ensues.
The inflated ego nature should be brought up as well of some of these 20th century thinkers, all like Heidegger, Deleuze, Wittgenstein, the main culprits, but all of the ones that sit under their families, like seriously, like 1,000 Platos, you can read it any which way. Each of them is a Plato. You can read it backwards and it syncs up with Dark Side of the Moon. Like there's a level of glazing within this family of erudites that really like has been taken up a notch as well. If we're trying to be, we want to be intoxicated, but through sobriety, we want to reach intoxication. And that can be difficult when you explore some of these thinkers. So I wanted to pay some credit to that as well.
Yeah. So to give a quick account of Wittgenstein, he was kind of a genius from a young age. I think he was born in a pretty wealthy family, I want to say.
Yeah.
And where was he from?
Austria.
He was Austrian. He actually served on the front lines. He was like a firearms mechanic or something of the sort, and was enrolled in the military at a certain stage. But essentially, just a genius and had big aspirations and lots of things he wanted to do. I guess didn't really need to put the time in to master something, but then also sort of learn that you almost get an arrogance that it's like, it's not worth my time to learn this thing and give it like proper treatment because I just know the answer. That happens like a couple of times at like major points in his life.
He also had some deserved and warranted approval from, we should bring up Bertrand Russell, right? Whose tutelage he was under. And it's almost like, well, Bertrand thinks I'm the real deal, so I must be onto something. And Bertrand wasn't sure himself.
Yeah. Yes. And Wittgenstein sort of got into this, like he was enjoyed problem solving, ridiculous IQ. And he wrote to Frege, who was a philosopher kind of earlier than Russell, also like a logician and an analytical philosopher, part of the analytic tradition. And he was working on the problem of Frege of trying to solve the logical inconsistency at the core of mathematics. How to, yeah, I guess I couldn't tell you exactly what he was working on, but he was the foundations of mathematics, how we can deduce it and know it is real without having a referent to an external source. And Wittgenstein wrote to Frege with a solve for this problem, and he really believed that he had solved it. And he wrote to Frege and gave him his theorem and his proofs. Frege read it and thought, this guy's a genius, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, you're wrong here, here, and here. Sends it back and then recommends Wittgenstein goes and studies at Cambridge or wherever. And that's when he goes and meets Russell, becomes a student, and Wittgenstein ends up having such a large influence on Bertrand Russell. And yeah, as you say, Russell saw a lot in Wittgenstein and taught him, and he was there for 5 or so years. And, you know, Russell was the one to help get Wittgenstein up to that, up the ranks in academia, and did so quite effectively. Wittgenstein, when he's there and the war is breaking out at this time, the First World War, he's working on the Tractatus at this time. And even when he was in war, when he was in the trenches, he had a manuscript of the Tractatus in his backpack. He was working on it during that time. And when he comes back and finishes it, he kind of hands it in and says, look, according to this theory of meaning, philosophy is meaningless. Like, according to this set of facts and this picture theory, the words we're using must describe real things and objects in the world. And when we conflate them to talking about these abstract entities, we're not able to discernibly know that we're making real propositions. And so he says, you know, philosophy is essentially done for. There's a method to resolve the philosophical disputes we're having, but that is just to show where the logical inconsistencies are, and it doesn't ground into a disclosure about reality. It just grounds into getting the facts straight about how we're using language, like in a logical.
Flesh this out, because this is like a really crux thing. He's not saying everything hitherto is nonsense, full stop. He's not saying being, substance, the study of these things are stupid. He's saying that when they don't map onto a possible state of affairs, they're stupid and meaningless. And for him, yes, a proposition is only a proposition if it maps a possible state of affairs. So it's very highly contingent what he's saying. It's not just everything is nonsense. Everything is nonsense within a certain paradigm. And most of the time we're engaged in that illusory paradigm is what he's saying.
Yeah, and so Wittgenstein sort of hands in this paper, gives it to Russell, and believes that he's essentially completed philosophy. Like, he's, again, in the same way that he tried to come to Frege and say, look, I've solved this mathematical problem. Here are my proofs. He does the same thing to philosophy, and then like leaves academia. He goes off literally into the countryside and becomes a teacher. Like and then 6 years later, he actually gets stood down for like hitting a kid. But just that's how you were disciplining back in the day, right? You had canes and stuff, but yeah, he got kicked out, which is honestly, like, I'm not gonna say it, but it's more credit to him. But so he really leaves, and I mean, a lot of the philosophers at that time did leave academia because you had just had the First World War and you were devastated, and part of their response was to like teach and educate the next generation so that something like that would never happen again. but it also shows how, like, where his beliefs were and the stakes that he put on this. And yeah, to kind of wrap up the biography, he writes a later work called Philosophical Investigations, published after his death. And what we get there is a really different philosophy to his first one. So there's a earlier Wittgenstein and a later Wittgenstein that are often read as two, complementary but separate accounts. And interestingly, like, Wittgenstein would say that you should read them both together at the same time to get the full picture and the full movement between them. They are almost like a antagonistic towards each other, but also complementary in that same fashion. So that's a bit of a picture of who he was. Are there any other flavors you'd like to add about him before we then get into like the crux of it?
I just want to clarify, he couldn't have literally said to read them in tandem, right? Because the second book was published posthumously. Do you mean like scholars of his have said that?
Yeah, I wonder if he alluded to something like that, but yeah, he didn't literally say, "Here are my books, read them together." But it was like these notes later on, and maybe through his students and what they learned from him, like that kind of transmission was to say, "Okay, now we're supposed to read these together."
Cool. Now let's get into the crux of it then.
Yeah, Wittgenstein's picture theory of meaning is something that has come up a few times, and this is what was developed in the Tractatus and his earlier work. Both works, by the way, dispel with philosophy. They both have different ways of saying that philosophy is meaningless, which is quite comical. But I mean, there's real sense to it, and so his idea was that, I mean, at the heart of it, being a philosopher and a logician and mathematician, you believe that formal structures can really point to reality. In the kind of example we had of language kind of being pragmatics in a social situation and semantics in that linguistic situation, and then syntax just in the structure and order of that. Language is extraordinarily impressive as to how scientific you can be with it, because through philosophers and through scientists like Chomsky, he was a bit of everything. He was not one thing. One of the last greatest polymaths that we've had, and like real public intellectuals that we've had, he kind of changed the field and study of linguistics so impressively because of what he was able to find through a study of universal grammar and learning about the structures of language in a deep way that you could then generalize to every language. And you could also validate the claims by hypothesizing and testing it and going out and studying language and seeing if this sentence makes sense in that language versus doesn't, and what if you arrange it in this way. So there's a lot of, like, language is a great case of being able to demonstrate a philosophical rigor to what we're talking about. And it's from that, like, abstracting about language to that syntax is what gives us power to generalize and see and understand the universals in language. And Wittgenstein kind of obviously subscribed to that. And so the account of meaning that he gives and what words must be doing to have real meaning was to kind of give a bit more of an abstracted account. And he, like, Bertrand Russell was essentially a logical atomist, which meant that the truth of things could be found by looking at their lowest units of truth value and seeing that something at a big picture, like how something mechanical works or how a system works or why an interaction happened, can kind of be deduced by the small units of meaning that led to it and comprised it. And so in Wittgenstein's picture theory, he's wanting to show that on the one hand, world are made up of facts, the things that are common sense to us. That is what the world is. And I think he opens one of his books with a crazy sentence like the world is all that is the case, which in a sense means that what there are the facts and our deduction of the facts, like a very, I want to say masculine, I want to say left hemisphere way of thinking about what the world is, like everything we can know in actuality or in possibility. And what are facts but a collection of states of affairs, things as they are, occurrences, and what's happening. And then you would say that the states of affairs are a collection of objects, that they can be reduced and learned by the kind of constituent elements of them. I could give an example, but I think it might be a little bit boring. So, but just it's a way of kind of structuring, okay, facts are things that are happening, are different objects in the world. So it's very much more like a looking at the relata and then looking at the relations and therefore getting what is happening and the facts of the world. And you would say that language has a similar structure where language consists of propositions, what we're saying. If I say my hat is hanging on the hook, it's a proposition, it can be validated. The propositions are made up entirely of elementary propositions. So my is a reference to this person, hat is a reference to that object, is hanging is a verb that denotes its state, on the hook, the place. So you have the subject and predicate. And then the one layer below that, which breaks that down, is just that names denote objects. So the words that we have mean specific things, denote things in the world, or denote relations that those things have. And the picture theory of language comes in because he's saying that each stage of that is a picture of the one before it. It enframes what is taking place in the state before. So the hat hanging on the hook, saying that as a proposition is, you can see that picture in the elementary propositions and you can see that picture in the names that there are. And so it sort of ladders up and down in a way that is bringing greater resolution to what there is. And it's interesting how that even goes in a different direction to Plato, who's almost laddering up. It's almost like if you could have a laddering up and a laddering down and somehow get the best of both worlds, then you'd have a cogent metaphysics. More on that in episode 14. Seen in that way, like, does helpfully elucidate some real facts about the world. It's pretty like dry and analytical, and you can see why, the practice of logic involves like many long scripts and signs and deductions. And even if you do this exercise, which I did in linguistics class at uni, you were like writing out you had a sentence, a very simple sentence, and then you had to unpack, like, there was a name for it, but it was essentially like the semantically what was being communicated. And you would break it down and like create this tree of it to say like, well, this is this part of the sentence and this is this function, and do this big tree diagram of it. And it got you to like a very complex and complicated set of like relations of what has to go where and why and how it only makes sense because that's in that order. And you do like so much effort to learn that, and it's just something that we can say so naturally. So there really is a wealth of complex communication that we're able to do and grasp so effortlessly and so easily, which is like just an amazing fact of language. But I guess this is just giving credit to some of the basis of that idea of almost that, how meaning can like really decompose and be found at different micro levels to exist. Is there anything you'd add here at this point?
No, it would be my own riffs on top of that, but do you want to finish this thought?
Yeah, I'll go through finish and then we can just open it up.
Yeah.
formal representations been actually able to denote the things that they represent. Like these two come together where propositions of language describe actual or possible facts. The elementary propositions describe states of affairs, and the names denote the objects. So it's at that base level that there's contact. And he would say like that the laddering up is only possible because there's that connection at the bottom where the names of things, the name for things of which we have, are actualized in the world and, you know, describe a real or possible thing. And so that's a little bit of where we get logical atomism, is like looking at it at that value, at that level of resolution. And the logical positivists and Wittgenstein would also say that it's through that empirical method that we can deduce whether our names are denoting real objects. Like it is the scientific enterprise which can show us if they are in fact true and essentially try and like confirm our common sense beliefs. You know, the world consists of everything that is the case. Like it's what is common sense to us. How can science just elucidate and articulate what's common sense? And so what this is getting to is to say that the objects with which our names can represent, you know, are restricted to what we can know about them and what we can, I guess, scientifically understand. Like if we use reason and observation, how we can come to learn something, that is the space that the names that we have for things exist and live in. So that's why for Wittgenstein, there were things like our religious beliefs or aesthetic values or ethics, which you couldn't put the same names on. You couldn't talk about, essentially, because when you tried to talk about them, you were no longer talking about things which had actual references that made sense. You were now talking about non-referential things, and by literal definition for Wittgenstein, were nonsense. So that's where the rubber meets the road in some sense, and that's why something like metaphysics can't be done, because you don't have that deepest connection of words describing objects. And so although these are some areas that are very important for humans, according to Wittgenstein, you know, there's that famous quote, "Whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent." And so it's almost like Wittgenstein, although he had crucified language, he wasn't super happy to have done that. You can always see him as a Nietzschean, you know, as a Nietzschean antichrist, but for metaphysics, language is dead and we have killed it. You know, what will we do with all? How will we wash away all the blood? So I think that's just me laying out the critique and essentially, why he thinks that there's an impasse to doing metaphysics in a really deep way.
My goodness, man. My goodness. If I don't have anything to say back on that, we don't have a podcast, do we? Very rigorous, and I think what I would call a typology. It feels like you were really just starting from 0, building out, almost like a classification system, starting with Nietzsche's, Noam Chomsky's universal grammar, almost like Tower of Babel like structure, reaching up to the heavens, all the way down to, I think you said, is it the semantic or the symbolic at the bottommost?
Syntactic.
Syntactic, right. I want to make the move I make a lot and very often, which is to take us a few steps back once more before launching and propulsing all the way forward in episode 9. And I almost feel like I want to do that. You've done that at a linguistic level with what you've expounded upon and laid out. I want to do that again at the level of the dynamic inner model and workings of our mind and heart and soul and psyche, and bring in the quote that I mentioned right at the beginning about from difference and repetition, but talk about representation and the supremacy of the phenomenology of the correct mode of representation more directly. So it's not trivial to say that identity, that difference has been subordinated to identity, because this ties in very closely with how we utilize and how language utilizes us in favor and in subservience of truth. Because what we're doing when we clarify anything, if philosophy is a concept clarification apparatus, all we're doing is reaching conceptual differences, not concepts of differences. And that's symbolic of us reaching conceptual this and that, but not concepts of this or that. We're not moving the baton forward. We're not passing it on in this relay race of intergenerational warring and dialogue between the greatest minds if we're not even ordered properly. Now, it's highly relative what proper ordering looks like. I want to bring back someone we long ago forgot about, called Aristotle, and talk about his idea. Talk about his idea of
Who's that guy?
difference as. I want to tie in difference with representation, with language here, and in this kind of synthesized whole, and hopefully present some sort of a case or an answer to what you're saying. Not that there's a question, but there's an open-ended invite, and I want to take that with both hands. And I would say with Aristotle, it's widely acknowledged. Hegel and Leibniz both talk about Aristotle's organic representation, right? Structure, hierarchy, taxonomy, and ultimately tamed ideas, if we liken those forms as being limiting. And then Hegel or Leibniz himself, less so Kant, would talk about or live out a philosophy in which difference is represented more orgiastically, right? It's more free, it's more untethered, it's more dynamic, it's more excessive, and it's like the shackles have been removed. But then that's when the difference in repetition move comes in, which is no, like, because negation is still serving totality. There's still what you're calling multiplicity, what you're calling a dichotomous relationship, is still grounding itself out in unity. So you're making the same move in Kantian fashion by means of a means. We know, I guess you can say, very much in the 20th century, but post-Nietzsche, really, post-Freud, Nietzsche, Adler even, that forces, drives, and intensities are so at the fundament and at the basal most layer of our life and phenomenological ordering that, well, we know that, like, as a standalone fact, basically. And so, yeah, how do we treat representation fairly? How do we live, like, I don't want to say anti-representationally, but I feel like we're cursed, we're shackled by this thing and this modality of facing the world we call representation, where, right, Deleuze talks about the image of thought. Can we express and establish a new image of thought in our cognition, where the psychotechnologies are so drastically different if you don't have to think about things as being corollaries or correspondences with objects in the world, right? Can we, in a manner and in a way of subserving and moving us forward in philosophy, can we actually detach from meaning altogether? You know, so that's kind of like a weird and novel thought. But the other thing that was coming to mind as you were talking is, we've talked about absorption and implosion in the hyperreal. There's also the implosion of empiricism, right? Empiricism, in layman's terms, is just likened to be a simple appeal to lived reality, like lived experience. But we also know, in spirit of the 20th century, that what we're doing when we are kind of like reverting to what we call empiricism is a very fanciful concept creation, right? Because every perspective is provisional. What you call an appeal to lived experience cannot possibly be that. It cannot, a concept, a thing cannot simply be a mental representation. It cannot be, a concept cannot be an abstraction from a thing. Like, this is just such a, like, I don't even want to say empiricism. This is a mode of thought 101. Like, object is over there, concept is in here, in my encased head, in my brain, in my skull, in my cranium, and the concept represents something that corresponds to that lived reality there. And when we say empiricism, all we mean is the concept is kind of not taking a life of its own. I see that there, and I'm calling a spade a spade. So it's that simple agrarian move, I want to say. But what if the concept itself, in its existence, in its essence, has a force and a function, and as Kant, I think it's Kant who says, is beyond anthropological predicates, right? This again rewires our phenomenology once again. Categories, for Kant, categories are tied to human cognition, but for 20th century thinkers, Wittgenstein first and foremost, those categories are completely unshackled now. Categories have their own reality. Human cognition is over here. What the fuck does that mean for language? Because language is a subset of human cognition. Arguably, you can say like the exact inverse of that as well. But yeah, like how can we say language is over here and categories are over there, and all we're doing is depicting categories as elegantly, as clearly, as lucidly as possible. I know there's more to it with the universal grammar idea, but I'm just picking at one strand of that. When we try to bring in a higher degree of fluidity into our phenomenology, phrases, really elegant poetic phrases, start to become a lived reality, like along a moving horizon, the decentered center, right? We spoke in 3 or 4 episodes ago more heavily about existentialism and grounding your faith in that which you know is ungrounded. How can we do that when we're reverting to like just these like basic, simplistic Luddite thoughts, like a concept is nothing more than a mental abstraction of a thing over there? And that's not what these 20th century thinkers are doing, but I feel like they're still not going far enough. And to bring back Aristotle, just the final little segue here. One of the best books I've ever read is Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric. But in it, he basically pays a lot of credit to the art of rhetoric as the science of persuasion. And I know rhetoric isn't reducible to language and our use and abuse of it. Rhetoric is kind of like, is not delimited to a field of study. It's not a subject. Rhetoric is cross-disciplinary. Things like logic and dialectic are more specific and tied to a subject. And yeah, most fundamentally, because I want to invoke the person making the statement, the proposition about the state of affairs, what is his mood? What is his mode? Is he feeling down? Philosophy is physiology, right? I can say the same proposition and have it hang meaningfully or unmeaningfully as part of a wider node in a web of state of affairs, decentered myself, or I can be centered, and those two mean vastly different things. We've kind of given the devil his due with this in a few episodes ago, but it does kind of erupt the science of rhetoric, logic, use of language when we, I guess, take this idea seriously, right? Because it makes it seem unsystematic. There's an unpredictability of the means and the effects of oration widely. That's why for the ancient Greeks, because we're talking about Aristotle's Metaphysics, the ancient Greeks held in great prestige the art of oration. Can you cogently articulate? Can you self-express? All of the greatest work that came from that time, which for me is the Iliad, is a cry. It's a song. It's almost like a dithyramb to of the great heroes to woo Achilles back into battle. Right? The power of persuasion of how you speak, the manner in which you speak, who speaks, when they speak. So yeah, I guess that just opens the floodgates in terms of introducing a whole new litany of variables. But there is linguistic expression, and then there's like the actual reality that undergirds that, is what I'm saying there.
Is, I think, a lot of picture in what you're saying. And I appreciate it. And that's essentially some of the place that I wanted to go as a response to this as well. And like what I hear is a lot of a response to Wittgenstein, and in a way which is saying, hey, there's a big framing upstream that we need to have. There's a bit of a yeah, a pivot, but it's more like there's a deeper understanding, like to stand under, of what language is and the whole context that it shows up in before we start to take it apart, and before we start to take apart what it is doing for us and what it's able to do for us. Yeah, why don't we first look at what we are doing to it when we are, seeing it in a logically reductive way? When we're looking at the truth value of words as, or when we're looking at something like how meaningful a word is how it represents a true state of affairs. As you said, like, what is even meaning in this context? And our representation of meaning is probably the thing at fault rather than the language itself by which we're seeing that. Like, I guess, and almost, some of what you're bringing up too, and that, like, being really fluid to our understanding, and needing to do that in philosophy today, to be fluid with our concepts and our emotional life, being regulated to a kind of fluidity and mindfulness there, and how that is the will to power, that is the will to empowerment, is finding ourselves not holding on to any one thing that's passing by, but being an observer of those thoughts and systems and ideas which are passing by. In the same way, like, how we're really understanding language needs to undergo a similar transformation of being fluid to what these meanings are, almost in the same way that when we're really understanding subjectivity, we find we can't understand it without any notion of objectivity, and we can't understand objectivity without any notion of the subject, and the concept is the thing that clarifies and unifies those two. And what is language but a collection of concepts that we use at our command and our disposal, and it uses us at its command and its disposal. Like, that's the point Heidegger makes, is we don't have language as a tool. Like, we are in some ways the tools of language as well, because we just because
The limits of my language are the limits of my world. Concept creation, right? To bring in Tyler Durden, the things you own end up owning you. And language owns us, but we were once domesticating it, and the tables have turned. And it makes me think, like, is there validity to just tuning in, turning on, and dropping out? Because how much rewiring can you do? I mean, this is a genuine field of study, right? Psionics, like psychic electronics, can really help push us along. Like, how much traditional outward scientific study are you going to do of, here's the other substructure we missed 50 years ago in language, here's the other minor thing, like, we need a wholesale change. And then that begs the question, to what end? We need a change for what? What's wrong right now? Well, I don't have enough power. That's the problem.
Well, what we need now is obviously a metaphysical transformation, and we hope that metaphysical transformation affords us a new set of values, a new language, new ways of connecting and being in community. Like, it's that deep is what we are needing.
Something Nietzsche says, obviously everyone knows the quote from the gay science that we've brought up about, God is dead, and that's been parodied and caricatured a lot. Something he says in Beyond Good and Evil that doesn't get parodied as often is, we are not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. And it just kind of points to the confusion in categories that I've been harping on about for so long. Does God exist? And we've talked about this as well. God is an entity. That is a classification claim. And God exists or doesn't exist is an ontological claim. But we just, through the word is, right? Copula, existence, the trifold. I think, I forget the name of the author, but in the Metaphysics of Meaning, that bro writes about this exact example as well. Yes. Katz? Yeah.
Katz.
Gerald Katz.
Gerald J.
Brings up this example as well, but you can't conduct metaphysics when you're thinking and feeling and speaking in a language where the word is can be used to indicate any number of things. I remember, this is such a stupid anecdotal example, but I remember how kind of shocked I was in 2015 when the word selfie became an official word in the Oxford Dictionary. And I thought, wait a second, like, is that all it takes? And is that all it takes? Like enough people start using it, and then now it's an official word. And because I don't know why, like I guess just my not even adolescent at the time, prepubescent mind thought there's like a divine like emanation and order to these words that they come down to us from somewhere. And I guess part of growing up and as a male is seeing that your father isn't Superman and seeing that he's a human being and seeing that he's also living life as a parent for the first time, but as an adult for the first time, right? There's no manuscript. And I just kind of thought there's no manuscript with language as well. Like words are just coming and going as per their own discretion, seemingly in fashion of what you were saying about technology is potentially, overreaching and owning us. But yeah, I have some other stuff to say on that, but any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm thinking of adding a bit more here and now bring in Heidegger because, he's almost part of that German tradition coming post-German idealism. And as you mentioned, Kant and Hegel and, the concept the concept being organic, but yeah, like not taking an organic form in some ways. It exists and has life and has its own dimensions and realities and movements that is more like grounded in spirit rather than grounded in fact or grounded in object. Like, what if the concept was grounded in spirit? Yeah, I'm just going to put a pin in that one. What I want to get to is it's again like, and why it feels fitting to put it in here is because we're talking about some philosophers coming from similar lines of tradition. Heidegger's he has this book on the way to language, and so he's not dressing language to the same depth as in Being in Time, his magnum opus, as things like authenticity and nothingness, but he has a lot to say about it in his book On the Way to Language. And for him, he was also, and partly why I was so interested in learning about this, because he brings in like the impact and influence that technology is having on language in a very big way. And that sort of profoundly fits in with what we have been talking about, in technology. Like we have been talking about all the ways that technology is, I guess, impacting and affecting our relationships and our mental health and our ability to discern truth. For Heidegger, he really foresaw how it's impacting our language and how that is mechanizing our language and I guess degrading the level of authenticity that we can have in our language. And so in his book, he really asks what's an authentic understanding of how language operates. And he's wanting to get at what it is originally. It's a big move that Heidegger makes, I guess. Like, what is experience originally? What is revelation originally? Dasein and Aletheia. And it's an interesting work. And I think for Heidegger, like he wants to see phenomenology. He's going to our Dasein, into the appearance of how we are situated in the world, and from that point wants to come to understand how language is functioning and how to view it in certain ways as that had been viewed at his time was to miss its point. So even today, like, and one of the points that Heidegger would make is kind of technology is giving us a new way of thinking and even just different languages and concepts that we didn't have before, which is almost, it's like quite specialized and mechanized, but it's also fragmenting to what language is.
What type of tea is it?
Lemon and ginger.
If you were Cristiano Ronaldo, it would be a penalty.
Wow.
I'm leaving that in the recording. That's going to be the soundbite.
And so for Heidegger, language is becoming more technologized in a way. It's it's become, with the advent of technology and its influence that that's had in the Industrial Revolution, and how even to talk and act in the context of industry is to reference things in such a way and to learn new metaphors and to internalize those metaphors, internalize that structured way of thinking into the language. As that becomes like quite specialized and siloed, and different language games are formed to operate within each specific industry, so it also becomes fragmented. And then also the subject matter of what we're talking about for most of our lives, being at work and in a technological environment, is like we become disinterested by it. How many people are going to work and aren't passionate about their work? So many people. Like, and work is not something that everyone's supposed to be inspired by or passionate about. There's some jobs that don't, lend themselves to that quality in some way. But I think we can, do a good job of everything and find a spark in so many things. And if it's not there, then it's probably not our vocation, and we should look to where we can find a passion in it. But putting that aside, like, the reality is a lot of it is, for a paycheck. It's to support a family. It's to support a livelihood rather than to be interested in that pursuit itself. And so from that, we kind of get like ripped off from ourselves, and we're disinterested. And that interest is a interesting word. It breaks down to into essay, which is inter, in between, and essay, essences. So to be interested is to be in between real essences, to almost have one frame and locus and center, and then to be in acknowledgement and in contact with another essence, and to be moving between them is almost like when you're interested in something, you're moving between one frame and into another.
Oh man, dude, I'm such a cuck for etymology. Thank you for that. I didn't know that.
And so to lose that is to, kind of undermine our ability to move between one real essence into another. And, it leaves us disinterested, which is actually a pretty difficult place to be. And if we think about even what that has to our language, and, even the corporate speak that governs a lot of our communications, and like network speak in some ways now, it's interesting to me, like how real versus just constructed these are. But when we talk about, synergy of teams and like key actions to take and performance indicators and execution and disruptive innovation, these are all concepts that are like buzzwords that if you say these in corporate life and culture, like, you're going up the ranks. But like,
This kid's gonna make it.
but really, what are you saying? Yeah, for Heidegger, there's something empty about them. There's something where they are tracking a metaphor that we've learned through technology, but where is the substance that reveals something about Dasein, about being? Like, or are they so siloed and in that corporation that the corporeality, the corporeal embodiment, isn't one that corresponds to a human embodiment, but like a industry or system, like a, like an insurance company, which is a lot more, technological in nature, with a series of risks and operations and discernments and judgments, but hard to see a system like that can operate and solve a real human to human, like first person contact solution in its language. And so from that perspective, we're inframed by language, the jobs that we're doing, and corporate speak is reflective of the framing that language is giving us.
A quick Baudrillard thing before I come back to Heidegger, because I want to stick to this idea of corporate overreach essentially into every facet of our lives, and us being able to not distinguish anymore where work ends and our actual life begins, especially for people that aren't passionate about what they do, which is the majority of people. There's a funny scene in the TV show Community where a character comes up for just one episode and his name is Subway. And Subway has paid him to go around and say this. And they present this as a concept called corpo-humanization, as the name sounds. The human has now become a walking billboard. And this is completely germane to Baudrillard's dissimulation and hyperreality idea, where the things that are most vengeful and most out to get you are hiding in plain sight. And that's done in this case through parodying the thing that is actually killing people. Corpo-humanization is like, I would like, we can talk about efficient cause, final cause. For most people, feeling like their soul is being extracted in exchange for their weekly paycheck is a genuine causal factor in why they're in their oppressive malaise in the way we described it, right? This constant sense of disquiet and anxiety. And anxiety is, again, where I want to bring Heidegger in, but this idea of hiding in plain sight is very apt and pertinent to our times of the most antagonistic force is the one that's right in your face and the one that's screaming at you, saying this and that, and the one that you least can do anything about. I just found that to be quite a mirror and a reflection of our times, which is quite intriguing. Anxiety, the reason I'm so obsessed with studying that as a temperament, as a state of being, as a feeling, as an emotion, is because that's the emotion or mood that Heidegger really locks in on when he talks about the Dasein. Anxiety, for him, it's an attunement, right? It's the attunement, the existential attunement in which man is brought before the nothing itself, as he says. And why it's particularly seriously applicable to our lives and very relatable is because we aren't scared of this or that, and anxiety isn't a fear of this or that. Anxiety is exactly its opposite. We if we had a problem to solve, we would solve it, but the problem most people feel is simulated confusion, right? The term we used before. One feels permanently ill at ease. It's in the face of existence itself. It's in the face of being in the world itself that the anxiety proliferates. It's not the fear of a lion that I can either get killed by or I can run away from. And so it's, words like, indifference and unhealthy forms of emotional detachment, anorexia, like indifference, being completely impartial to things where you ought to care. You ought to have difference. You ought to have hierarchy and logos and like chosen order, I want to say, but instead you have this leveling out, right? This grand equalizing effect across the board is kind of the statement of our times, you could say.
Absolutely. And it's something that Heidegger is what he kind of comes to in this book as well. And with what I was attempting to say before, but got cut off by a cough, was like our language reflects how we are inframed and what our frame of reference is for things in the world. And he would say that this kind of the influence of technology and the influence of other things, like we could even look at like meaning crisis as something that has been evolving since 2000 years ago. And for a variety of factors, we are now today. And Heidegger is someone who's responding to and addressing the meaning crisis by essentially showing the meaning that we have just in our everyday experience and what is there in our phenomenology. That's something that's like absolutely laden with meaning, such that we need a ladle to extract it because it's so deep and wide. But he's saying almost that it's language as we have it today is losing its capacity for us to be authentic with it, or to help us understand our real historical position. I think that's part of where that confusion and anxiety comes on, because we don't understand where we are historically. We don't have that same connection, through wisdom traditions to stories that span thousands of years ago. We have like a postmodern critique of past meaning structures and understanding that they're a little bit superfluous and relative. And we see it as, in a relative frame rather than a perspectivist frame. I don't know if I totally agree with Heidegger on that point. I almost feel like our historical position is one that, has a bit of confusion in it. I don't think that's necessarily showing that we are departed from what is really there. Like, I think we're always to some degree in that position, but I think that the confusion that we have today is symptomatic of a lot of things, but is also something that is like characteristic of our times in a way. And I think it is just our own lives is to deal with that confusion and after having dealt with it to continue on with the things we love. But I almost think that there's sort of like, if we wrestled with it and went through it and went through that understanding, then we'd be able to apply it to different areas of life. Like, what are the other areas that are confusing and paradoxical to us, and how can addressing the confusion of today's times and the uncanniness of AI and the lies of social media and the exploitation of like kind of capitalistic schemes, like, and like power hungry bureaucrats, even thinking of like the TV series The Boy, that is about these corrupt superheroes that are like kind of narcissistic and celebrities but doing so much wrong. Like, and that's kind of another representation of like culture and offers a bit of a criticism. But I think, like, can we learn something about how it is to relate to paradox in that kind of deepening of understanding, and teach ourselves how to respond to it in the same way, by the same token.
Yeah. Can you shoulder your burden? Can you carry a load as well? There's a hero's journey element once again resurfacing in all of this, I feel, because post the senescence into the anxious state comes the apotheosis moment, right? But just before that comes, before the hero has his, the beginnings of his soon-to-be zenith, so that he can have an amulet to take back and distribute and disperse amongst his people and therefore restore order. Before that happens, I just want to pay more weight to, because we're letting the cultural flood in as a genuine implication in what we're feeling, right? It's inescapable, right? You go to work, you do the job that you hate, you come back, and then you're bombarded by screens, seemingly against your own will. But if you don't, then the consequences are dire. If nothing else, then just at the level of, withdrawal symptoms, dopaministically. It's something else we can pay weight to culturally, is that we're very, very novel beings. We've all heard the phrase, human beings today have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. But the Paleolithic emotions part, like, let's not jump over this, right? It's only in the last, since Aristotle, basically, like, what you could say was one of the first ever time periods in history where different people started to live with each other, and you no longer worship the same gods as your neighbor. Like, how much implication, how many ramifications does that have on the structure and order of your time spent and your waking hours throughout the day? You no longer live in the same place where your ancestors once did. How can you feel grounded if you aren't actually traversing the same mud, soil, and dirt your grandfather walked on, and you're not fighting for the same cause? Right? John Vervaeke talks really elegantly about the idea of domicide, and that being a very pertinent novel condition on steroids now for us. Your neighbor doesn't worship the same God as you. Your home is being destroyed. You long for your mother. She's not there because of some twisted Oedipal complex type thing that, most people have. Like, half the people I talk to have a therapist. Like, it's absurd. And the other half, like, they need it. Like, I wish they would be the half that went to the therapist. But when you don't have your mother, short of that, you long for the divine mother. And how does that contort itself into a kind of like, yeah, an alienation, and eventually into a meaning crisis that really, really debilitates your day-to-day life. And so, yeah, he talks about syncretism, right? That would be a healthy amalgamation of different worldviews, but we are living in a time where we need syncretism and have none of it. We have endless information, endless knowledge hanging there, and no wisdom, right?
Absolutely. It is, yeah, also in what you're saying there is showing how in some ways, like a lot of those forces are maybe impacted by technology, but there's a lot more to that domicide and loss of home that is impacting us so much, like loss of spiritual homes, loss of familial homes, loss of cultural homes. We don't have that place to go to just kind of, yeah, like almost back to the womb for restoration. And so we're just always kind of confusedly outside trying to identify with the mother, but not knowing who our mothers are. And as like children, that's very damaging. And so to kind of become adults is to have a healthy relation to the mother in some sense, but also to then.
Even that's up for grabs, right? Is the nuclear home exploitation at its core? That, like, there's a huge stream of thought in the 20th century that itself is very fascist in its nature. So that's what I mean. It's like the ground is just erupting from everywhere.
Yeah, and I was even speaking like symbolically and from a Freudian lens of, yeah, not like to the family unit itself and the literal mother, but I guess, yeah, what's like the symbolic mother and the symbolic caregiver of our times and being in relation to that. And, it's even just like having someone that puts their hand up and organizes community. It's going to a festival with friends and finding inspiration from the music and the culture that there has been there. It's going to a dance practice where you can feel embodied and be with other people and share food. It's having your own practice of going for a walk and journaling, or just going for the walk's sake and enjoying a bit of your solitude for a time.
And you'd be content that there's nothing actually else to it other than that, if you weren't just on Instagram all day looking at people seemingly having other than that, Like, that in itself is plentiful if you're not constantly being bombarded by a fake, illusory moreness.
Yeah, it's a sensible attunement and sensitivity to sensibly what is substantial. Yeah, we need to recover those aspects. And I guess Aristotle is one way to. I mean, for us, it's like this practice and this course we're on is doing that, and we're using Aristotle for that purpose. But also, I think like the metaphysical transformation that we need is, partly a recovery of the traditions of the past, and it's partly a reinvention of our own future authentic traditions. There's a prayer I like to say, Maori prayer, like over, it's just a dinner time prayer, but starts with kia koe te tikanga, and it means like it's up to you to create your own traditions. It's up to you to give new life to the values that you want to live by. And so I think there is that ownership which comes back to the first person. And Aristotle is someone who can give us a comprehensive view of the world, so that we can like know the place we're at. We can lead on the world and not feel like we're slipping through because it's evanescent, but we can actually like have some real grounding in it.
Yeah, I think this has been the chat with the biggest breadth in terms of magnitude. Like the sheer latitudinal space we've covered is quite enormous. I don't really have too much else at the intellectual front I was going to share or riff on. Did you have any other closing thoughts? I do feel like it's a natural landing point, but for those that are still watching, before we do a formal wrap up, this was an attempt at a part 2 of a linguistic and scientific critique of metaphysics as a subject and as a study and as a podcast series as well. So yeah, we're following along with Aristotle's Metaphysics book, which is one of his most renowned, most revered, and seminal works throughout his oeuvre, but also like the catalog of philosophy as a whole. And so we're trying to explore it as deeply as possible through as many angles as possible. And because of that, sometimes we have to deviate from the book entirely because it's a node in a very large web. And we are nodes in a very large cultural and linguistic web. So we're trying to tie many facets and variables together in a way that is coherent somewhat for viewers and listeners and eloquent and fun for us to be participants in as well. So there's a lot of balls up in the air and we're trying to do as diligent a job as possible. Sir, do you have any closing thoughts?
I believe that. I think it's a great way to wrap up what we're doing here. And as you say, like there's just such a Aristotle's given account of such a range of things, and so yeah, the challenges that we can put to this and how we can authentically embody our voyage here is to bring together things like that go to the depths of us, go to the depths of our culture and society. That's all what's been asked for in doing this metaphysical work. And I think like what we are showing is how the metaphysical transformation that's needed can be had by reading Aristotle per se, going back over 2,000 years and doing that rereading of those substantial texts and those foundational texts of the discipline is one of the ways that we can re-find a metaphysics that's connecting us to a tradition. It's grounded in a tradition that gives us a kind of home among philosophers and among thinkers, and in their language and thought we can re-find ourselves. We can walk the paths that they walked, and doing it in a conceptual way rather than that physical way. So this is also a way to rekindle the opposite of domicide and re-find that deep connection.
Find and grow a home, and even create one where there isn't one, but there needs to be one, a la the intellectual Silk Road.
That's why the fire, it's transforming us, and it's also a well-known place and a homely place.
And for most of human history, it was the only source of heat and light. except for the love of your unfascist mother, right?
The good old days.
The good old days, yeah, when everything was an appropriation. Thanks so much for joining us and for sticking it out till this point. The intention is that the next episode and discussion will be number 9 and more back to the book proper and going through the chapters and pages and picking out what piques our interest and riffing on those more specifically, because I feel like we've added a lot of layers of context and got a lot off our chest, heart, and soul in these discussions that have been ensouling. So thank you to my good comrade Alex and to the viewers for bringing us into triple digits of subscribers. Let's make it quadruple before the end of this year. Anything else from you, Alex?
Hell yeah. Let's do it.
Okay. Thanks so much, people.